Welcome, everyone. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the various lands on which we're meeting and pay my respects to elders past and present. Thank you all very much for joining us for this webinar on the interim report of our inquiry into building a skilled and adaptable workforce. My name is Catherine de Fontenay. I'm here with Deputy Chair Alex Robson. We were the commissioners on this inquiry. Joining us also is our amazing team who wrote this report, led by Assistant Commissioner Jess Reed. So we're looking forward to stepping you through some of the recommendations in our report. So this report is part of a series of 5 inquiries that were commissioned by the Treasurer that are now feeding into the Productivity Roundtable that will be happening next week. Those 5 are creating a more dynamic and resilient economy, investing in cheaper, cleaner energy and the net zero transformation, harnessing data and digital technologies, building a skilled and adaptable workforce, and delivering quality care more efficiently. The Treasurer particularly asked us to focus on finding recommendations that could be actioned in the short term that would make a difference to Australia's productivity. So what did we focus on in this area of building a skilled and adaptable workforce? We were very mindful that there's been a lot of reform in the skills and in the flexibility area more broadly. So there has been the University Accord. There have been major changes to the vocational education system. And there's been some major change to industrial relations legislation. And it's our view that probably a couple more years are needed before those changes can be evaluated. So we decided to focus on adaptability. The evidence shows that there is a lot of occupational change happening every year, and that has been going on in most countries and for quite some time. And you might expect that new technology is going to change that even further, make even more occupational change a part of life. And the fact that we live longer will also be a factor. So one estimate is that on average, Australians will change occupation 2.4 times in the next couple of decades. And so that's going to mean that we need the skills to enter a new occupation and the ability to enter a new occupation. So we decided to focus on 3 things. The first is how to improve foundation skills at school to ensure that every student leaves school with the foundation skills in reading, in mathematics, and in digital to be able to learn new things. Without foundation skills, it's almost impossible to learn new skills further down the track. The next thing we wanted to concentrate on were for people who had started their work life, have we got good options for upskilling on the job, for getting training while working, and possibly for going back to get an additional qualification? Is it easier to go back to vocational education or back to university once you've started working? And then the final area is how hard is it to enter a new occupation? Can we reduce the entry regulations into a new occupation so that it's easier to try a new occupation or to enter an occupation that you're suited to? So let's talk about those in turn. First, foundation skills. There is a lot of data, and that data is not great. As many of you know, we have greatly expanded the funding for our schools, but we have not seen a big improvement in NAPLAN scores over that period of time. So you can see there the results for year 9 that is meant to be the fruition of investments we've made over the years. And NAPLAN scores in year 9 have not improved at all. Over the same period, our PISA scores, which is an international comparison across countries, our PISA scores have been falling in mathematics, science, and reading. Particularly worrying is that our school system is not fully delivering on our goal of equity in education. So we're seeing that students who enter with a disadvantage, that disadvantage is persisting. These top graphs show that if we look at schools that are in the bottom 10% in terms of socioeconomic disadvantage, about 20 to 25% of those students are below the minimum standard for NAPLAN. 20 to 25% of those schools below the minimum standard. Meanwhile, if we look at schools that are in the middle of the range socioeconomically or at the bottom of the range, the number of students who are below the minimum standard is tiny. So that is a serious concern. We're seeing that students below the minimum standard, that's a measure of disadvantage, and it's related to you coming into schools that are less advantaged. Earlier work that the PC did showed that the gaps in outcomes between students who come in with disadvantage and other students are persistent, and that students are not catching up. Once students fall behind, they're unlikely to catch up over the course of the years. And that's really a worry, right? What we'd like to see is a school system where you might come in with a disadvantage, but the school system helps you to catch up to the other students. The fact that some students are behind and are staying behind also means that teachers face an almost impossible task of teaching to a wide range of abilities in the same year level and often in the same class. So this graph shows that 53% of schools have students below the minimum year level and above and at maximum NAPLAN level in the same year. And so teachers are teaching to a very broad range of abilities, and it makes it very hard to catch up because the teacher is aiming at the middle of that range, and students that are struggling do not have material targeted to them. At the same time, different jurisdictions have started making more materials available to teachers to help them in this challenging task. And it's exciting. There has been a lot of change in this space. High quality materials are available, but they're not universally accessible and they don't have full coverage yet. So we have the Catholic sector active in this space, national agencies, several state systems. But access can be limited for some teachers. We're still finding that teachers spend an average of 6 hours a week searching for curriculum materials. So that certainly suggests that they're not all finding access easy. And so we have a risk here that there will be duplication of effort and investment, that there'll be confusion for teachers about where to find the materials that they need, and inconsistency that less advantaged schools are going to have less access and their students will struggle to catch up. And so our first reform is that the Australian government should invest in a single online national platform that houses a comprehensive bank of high quality curriculum-aligned lesson planning materials. These materials should be publicly available to teachers in all states and territories and across all school sectors, including the Catholic and independent schools. And so we think it should cover F to 10. We think that it should include support materials. And in particular, we think it should include professional learning programs to help teachers best use that material, to make the best use of it. What do we need from those lesson plans? For them to be the most useful to teachers, we need them to be structured, to follow a sequence, so that if you take a sequence on fractions, you'll have a full series of lesson materials that you can follow that are connected to each other. We need them to be available for all subjects. We need teachers still to have autonomy, so those lesson materials need to be editable and adaptable to the local context to support the autonomy and the expertise of schools and of teachers. And most importantly, they need to be scaffolded. They need to have materials for those students that have fallen behind, materials that are at a simpler level that help them gradually build up to the classes level. And so we think that with that component, with those characteristics, lesson plans can really assist like teachers in delivering the best possible outcome for all of the class. We also think that artificial intelligence and educational technology could help in this effort. So there's a few ways that AI could help. It can help in terms of class preparation aids. So We think that it could help in tweaking a piece of curriculum material to be more suited to the particular class. This is a math example about sailing. Could you write it? Could you adapt it for a class that has never seen the ocean, for example? We think that it could possibly be used, certain types of technology could help you more quickly adapt materials to different abilities and to specific contexts. We think that artificial intelligence is particularly helpful for assessment and feedback, having questions that ask the student specifically about the things they're struggling with and can provide feedback about where they need more learning, and let the teacher know what they're struggling with. That could be a real asset to teachers. And having materials that students can follow themselves that adapt to where they are currently struggling, again, is something that really on your own will allow you to get up to the class's level. Now, where are we up to with AI? It's a complicated space. We think that most of the states and territories are on a similar journey, but they're at different points in that journey. So a lot of school systems are mainly trying to grapple with the generative AI boom and the fact that a lot of students are using it in an unsanctioned way. A lot of teachers are using it in an unsanctioned way. So at the moment, they're trying to deal with that and trying to reimagine assessment. Some school systems are further along and have developed their own AI tools that can help teachers adjust materials and can help students with their learning. So EduChat in New South Wales, EdChat in South Australia, those are very helpful for a sort of Socratic questioning the student, walking them along in their learning. It's not ChatGPT that gives you an answer that might or might not be right. It's a learning tool. So those are exciting, but at the moment, a number of schools are excluded from the benefits of these tools. And a lot of schools have very little guidance about what software might be helpful to them, what it might be helpful for, how should they use it in their teaching. So we worry that we will get certain schools excluded and missing out on the benefits of these technologies. So we think a nationally coordinated approach is needed, buying tools together as a group, a bit like the PBS, letting schools know what tools are actually helpful and for what. And when we do develop a new tool, making that available to all schools. And so our second recommendation is about that, is about taking a national approach, developing tools, sharing them with all schools, and using our combined purchasing power. And again, making sure we provide professional development for teachers and schools on how to use these tools. Okay, so that was foundation skills. Now we are thinking about people who have joined the workforce, and our goal is to make it easier for them to go back to vet or to uni to obtain additional qualifications or to undertake further training. And this is very important because not all adults have a formal qualification, but we estimate that more than 90% of forecasted jobs growth will, over the next 10 years, will be for jobs with a qualification. Now, I want to be clear, that's not all university qualifications. A lot of new jobs in vet and in other areas will be jobs that have to do with, jobs to do with the clean economy. Many of those jobs will be from the vocational sector, but all of them will be qualification oriented. And so we need to make it easier for workers to acquire qualifications. At the moment, the system of credit transfer, getting academic credit in your new degree for anything you might have done in the past, and our system for recognizing prior learning, for getting academic credit for something that you might have done in your work life, those systems are not working very effectively. Unfortunately, providers have perverse incentives when they're making these credit decisions. If they do not grant credit, then you will undertake more study with their institution, and so that's a perverse incentive. There isn't a lot that is encouraging institutions to be consistent and transparent in these decisions. And so as a result, this can be a big discouragement to undertaking further study because you aren't going to obtain any recognition for what you already know, what you've already studied. And so we think if there's a better system of credit recognition and recognition of prior learning, that'll make it easier to go back to study. It'll reduce repetition, just duplication of learning. It'll increase the chances that people undertake lifelong learning, and it will cost us less as a joined up system. So there's a few things that we think this is a broader area of reform, and the Department of Education will be undertaking some work on credit recognition. But we think there are a few things that can start that journey, start to get incentives aligned in the right direction. One is enforcing that vocational providers and universities must let a student know whether they will be gaining credit for prior study or prior learning on the job before the deadline for accepting an offer. So we have heard stories of students not finding out until 6 months into their degree whether they have earned any credit. We think that there should be a database of academic credit decisions so that universities and the Australian Tertiary Education Commission have information on whether there is consistency. If a university provides credit for a subject in a diploma of nursing from one vet provider, they should provide it for all vet providers, for example. And we think that there should be a model of coordinated assessments of recognition of prior learning, perhaps centralized locations where you can have your skills assessed, that would ensure that more prior learning is recognized. And we think the Australian Tertiary Education Commission will play a role in this space. And again, we're hopeful that this will encourage more workers to consider further qualifications. I'll now hand over to Alex.
Thanks, Catherine. So I'm going to talk about work-related training and then occupational entry regulations and licensing. In the next step of the adaptability story, we've also focused on work-related training. And so, particularly with the onset of new technologies and so on, workers are often required to work with that technology rather than being replaced by it. And so that is part of the consideration that we're thinking about in relation to work-related training. And the issue in Australia recently is that these training rates have stagnated across the economy, and also they tend to be concentrated in large businesses. So here is a sequence of charts that shows the second point there in terms of training by business size. So the participation rate tends to be much higher in large businesses than in small businesses. The share of trainees who train during working hours is much larger in larger businesses than in smaller businesses. And then the share of trainees who incur personal costs is much higher in small businesses than in large businesses. So that, in addition to this issue around stagnation of work-related training, tells us then that there is an issue potentially among small to medium sized businesses. In addition to all of these kinds of issues, there is a dearth of data on rates of training and so on, as well as evaluation of previous programs in this area. So our draft recommendation in this area is that we think that there need to be better targeted incentives to lift work-related training rates in those SMEs. We are mindful of the fact, though, that this is a space that has been, or a path that has been gone down before in Australia in various types of programs. So we think that there should be trials of financial incentives, for example, either tax credits or grants or other mechanisms to increase work-related training for SMEs. We've got an information request in the report around what those financial incentives would look like. And in addition to that, we also recommend a trial for small and medium enterprise advisory services to support work-related training. So there are a number of advisory services out there for, say, for example, starting a business and so on, but many are not tailored to actually to support work-related training. So it should be a trial, we think, before rolling this out more broadly. We need to be careful to make sure these things are effective and efficient, and part of that process would be that this trial should be evaluated carefully to determine its cost effectiveness and to better understand how advisory services and other supports can aid implementation and take up. So these ideas have been tried in other countries, but it's important in the Australian context to get a good handle on what works and what doesn't before fully diving into a more widespread program. So the aim there is really to address barriers to work-related training for small and medium enterprises. And again, that goes to the adaptability theme for people who are already in work. They may not necessarily want to change jobs immediately, but they may want to build up their skills. And so work-related training is obviously a good way to do that, to the extent that that isn't provided. We think a financial incentive and to do that directly is probably the best policy tool, but we need to be careful to evaluate those and trial them to make sure that taxpayers are getting value for money. And so the final topic that I'll talk about is occupational entry. And so, as Catherine mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, it is expected that Australians will change jobs and perhaps occupations several times during their life. And a question then is whether it is maybe too difficult to enter some occupations, and whether the regulatory environment may be too restrictive. Now, obviously, those regulations are put in place for a reason. They either relate to worker safety or consumer safety, or both of those things, or to improve so-called asymmetries of information in relation to quality of service. Occupational entry regulations are not the only way to do that, but they can be an important tool for governments to be able to address those concerns. So we are very mindful of the purpose of these kinds of regulations, particularly around either consumer or worker safety. But there's always a trade-off with these things, and the potential risk is, in some cases, they could reduce competition. They form a barrier to entry into certain occupations. That could lead to higher consumer prices than may be necessary. And instead of getting any service, a consumer may be left with not being able to afford a service at all. It can also reduce labour mobility if there's different restrictions either across occupations or across states and territories, and it can be bad for labour productivity and business dynamism. So that's the trade-offs that we face in general in thinking about occupational licensing or regulation or entry regulation. And the regulatory challenges are often that there's inadequate data to make informed decisions in terms of changing regulations for governments. Incumbents often may have perverse incentives to try to keep those entry restrictions in place, even though they may no longer be warranted or may not be warranted in the first place. So we have to be mindful of that. And there's limited resourcing in the states and territories for reviewing occupational entry requirements. So it turns out that we're not talking about a small set of occupations here. I think it's around 1 in 5 Australians face some sort of occupational entry regulation. And so in Australia, the history of this has been, to impose occupational licensing across the states and territories. And the issue is that as a result of that, entry regulations can vary widely across both occupations and across jurisdictions. And one way to measure that, which we've done in this report, is to take a methodology that was developed by the OECD and to apply it to different professions in Australia. And it turns out that for many of these occupations, there's a wide range of stringency. So, for example, If we take the taxi drivers, the one there on the bottom, we're going from less stringent at the bottom to more stringent at the top there in terms of that, the x-axis. In some jurisdictions, it's not so stringent, and in other jurisdictions in Australia, it's very stringent, and you can see the wide range there. For other professions, they're more uniformly regulated in terms of entry restrictions, and there's no range at all. So the point is then, if you think about this, is to say, well, why is it the case that some entry restrictions are more stringent in some places rather than others? And the answer might be, well, actually that has an effect on consumer or worker outcomes, and maybe that's why we have these wide ranges in some cases. If we look at the data, and again we're asking for information on this in the paper. In some industries, the stringency of requirements is not strongly correlated with quality and safety metrics. So here's an example where we look at motor mechanics. In some jurisdictions, they're required to be licensed. In other jurisdictions, they're not. And if you then plot that against, consumer outcomes or safety outcomes, there's no obvious correlation that's going on there in terms of the difference between licensed and unlicensed regimes. So that is a concern that you can point and say, well, what is going on there and what can be done about it? And so the policy question then is, well, if some of these things are too stringent in some jurisdictions, they probably should be looked at pretty carefully. Now, in Australia, we already have mutual recognition or automatic mutual recognition across some jurisdictions. And so, to the extent that applies, already jurisdictions are recognising that, well, you maybe have a less stringent, licensing regime in your state, but we're going to allow you to operate in our state where people face a more stringent licensing requirement. So it's already the case under something like automatic mutual recognition that this issue of stringency, it's sort of understood that, well, maybe safety outcomes or these other consumer outcomes, if we're allowing automatic mutual recognition, then that suggests that some of this extra stringency may not be warranted. Doesn't automatically mean that, but there's already these arrangements that are in place. So our recommendation in this area, and the aim is, again, we're very mindful of safety and consumer outcomes, but we think entry regulations should be at the minimum level that can ensure that. And the question is what that minimum level looks like. And we think state and territory regulators should work to eliminate those entry regulations that exist in their jurisdictions but not in others, so that the stringency where there is evidence that the regulations improve outcomes is weak. So that is obviously a blanket statement, but we think that is the right way to think about the trade-offs here. And we could start by looking, we think, based on the evidence that we looked at and feedback that we got during consultations around certain occupations. And we think that reductions in occupational entry regulations should be considered for motor vehicle repairers in New South Wales, WA and the ACT. So that relates to that chart that was up previously. Air conditioning and refrigeration mechanics in New South Wales, hairdressers in New South Wales and South Australia, and painters and decorators in New South Wales, Victoria, Queensland, WA and South Australia. So those are just a few examples. We're not saying, that those reductions should occur. We're just saying that they need to be carefully considered. But those are examples where if you apply that previous thinking, these are things that tend to stand out, but we're interested in hearing about other occupations as well, or indeed other occupations where this is not justified, and we'd be keen to hear the reasons why that may be the case. And so part of the other area in thinking about occupational entry is to allow entry in terms of qualification requirements to be expanded and streamlined and made easier. And so this involves taking capable candidates, so people who have the knowledge and skills but may not sort of fit into a conventional pathway, and allowing them to enter through simpler or non-traditional pathways. So we think that governments should assess whether the current regulated qualification requirements for occupations are proportionate to the identified risks, and think about alternative entry pathways. So we're talking here about people who are qualified for all intents and purposes, but just don't fit the narrow sort of entry requirements, and governments should think about ways in which to make that more flexible and expand entry without compromising all of those things that we talked about. And the reason is that, in certain professions and occupations, there's massive skill shortages. And so this is one way of addressing that, with the knowledge that there's people out there who may have the skills, or maybe with a little bit more training could qualify, but that pathway is just not available to them under current arrangements, and that doesn't benefit them, and it doesn't ultimately benefit consumers either, because they're missing out on the person with those skills who has to go away and do something else. And finally, we think that there needs to be overall, in terms of the processes for thinking about occupational licensing, so-called occupational licensing creep, better way of managing the existing stock or legacy licensing arrangements. So this is really a job for state and territory Treasury departments or the other relevant authorities responsible for regulating this policy advice. They need to work with licensing regulators to constantly and consistently review entry regulations in their jurisdiction. So this is not, in the world of technological change and everything that's going on, this is not a set and forget exercise. This is something that constantly needs to be monitored and assessed, because the world is changing. So that involves looking at things like sunset reviews and other reviews that are done on a regular basis, and to weed out some of these regulations that may no longer be fit for purpose. And we think that the Australian and state and territory governments should use the existing architecture which is in place around the national competition policy reform process to incentivise reform where that may be necessary. So that is it in terms of the content of our presentation. So we have just released, as Catherine said, these interim reports. The last one has been on the care economy, has been released overnight. So those are all now out in the public domain. We are keen to hear from people and get feedback in relation to those reports or information requests. Submissions formally are due on the 15th of September, with a view to providing final reports to government in December, and they will be released by the government along the usual process. So happy to answer some questions in the time we have remaining.
Thanks very much. So thank you all for listening in on that. We do have a little bit of time for questions. If you want to type your question into the Q&A, a member of our team, Peter Bond, will have a look at those and we'll read a few questions out to us.
Thanks, Catherine. We've got a couple of questions in there already. So
Go for it.
we just talked about occupational entry, so I'll ask one on that from Andrew Edwards. On occupational entry, is there a need for greater national consistency?
So we have put out a report on in the national competition policy space last week around the consistency issue for high risk occupations, and the question that we looked at there was whether a more national approach for certain occupations was warranted. The policy case there depends on the extent to which really automatic mutual recognition is working or not. I think it's fair to say. So we have some estimates in there on certain high-risk occupations, but you can see there, in the data we looked at on stringency, for some of these occupations, there is a wide range of stringency across, and so that that does tend to point, we think, to this idea of trying to reach minimum requirements. Whether how that's done depends on it's a sort of case by case basis, but the range is an issue if it's restricting labour mobility or if it's bad for consumers or workers in those particular regimes. On the other hand, it could be the case that for certain occupations it is there's justification for having cross-jurisdictional differences, but that is ultimately the question.
Thanks, Alex. So we've got one on RPL from Jane Newton. So the question is, the biggest barrier to RPL is the cost in time and money for the individual to undertake RPL. Most institutions charge the same amount to do the RPL process as for the actual qualification. How should or how could this be addressed?
Thanks, Jane. That's a great question. So I think that points to the perverse incentives on the part of the providers that we were discussing. Look, we're still exploring and we would love feedback on this in particular, but some of the things we're thinking about are, could this be assessed in a centralized way for a very low cost? For example, in Victoria, the Building and Plumbing Authority assesses plumber skills for a license. They do so at set dates at a number of TAFEs. So that might be a model that it could be rolled out in a more systematic way, having central locations where experts assess skills. In terms of past overseas qualifications, so that another group that needs RPL are people who undertook their qualifications overseas. There you might have some form of centralized assessment by the Australian Tertiary Education Commission. But it's still something we're exploring, so we'd love feedback.
Thanks, Catherine. So we've got one for the schools part of the report now from Stuart Glover. He said, given most of the high quality curriculum aligned resources come from third-party publishers rather than government created lesson banks, how do you think government might partner with industry to incentivise the creation of a diversity of new resources? And are you open to industry-based solutions where government works with industry to ensure these resources high quality?
Thanks, Stuart. That's an interesting question. That particular source of materials we have not given much thought to, but we'll go away and think about that. We do know that Arrow has funded the development of some materials. Sorry, the Australian Education Research Organization has funded a startup called Ochre, a not-for-profit that has developed a lot of high-quality materials. So in a centralized solution, we would like to see ideally those materials evaluated and made available if possible. Right now, those are available free of charge, but teachers have to know that they exist. In terms of for-profit providers, we will have to go away and think about that. Thank you.
Thanks, Catherine. We've probably got time for one more. So still in the school space, from Crystal, how does the report deal with socio-educational disadvantage and the impact that it has on the diversity of skills in the classroom?
Yes, so I think that what we're trying to do is provide tools that will help a teacher deal with that range of skills, regardless of the reason for that disadvantage. But it certainly is the case that schools that are more socioeconomically disadvantaged are more likely to have students, a larger number of students that have disadvantage. And certainly those schools may have less access to high quality materials and to high quality educational technology. So our goal here is to address socioeconomic disadvantage by making sure that absolutely all schools have access to high quality curriculum materials, to make sure that all of those schools are able to access high quality educational technology. I think that's probably all we have time for, but Alex and I and the team would just like to really thank you for joining us today. And as Alex said, we welcome submissions on the report telling us what we need to rethink, providing additional evidence and information, particularly if you can share evidence and data with us, we'd be very grateful for that. Thank you all very much for your time.
Thank you.